This tape shows the internal organs of the thorax and of the abdomen, and the male and female reproductive organs. In this first section, we'll look at the organs of the thorax. First the heart, then the lungs. We'll also look briefly at the esophagus. The thorax itself, the upper part of the trunk which contains the heart and lungs, is shown in tape 3 of this atlas. Here we're looking at the contents. To understand the heart, we'll begin by seeing where it is. We tend to put the heart here in our imagination, but in reality it's much closer to the midline. Seen from in front, the heart is here. It lies behind the sternum and directly above the diaphragm. Seen from the side, the heart is here, occupying almost all the space between the vertebral bodies behind and the sternum in front. When the diaphragm moves, the heart moves with it. To get our first look at the heart, we'll start by removing the upper extremities and all the shoulder muscles that surround the upper thorax, so as to leave just the thorax itself, enclosed by the ribs and intercostal muscles. Then we'll remove this part of the rib cage on each side, revealing the lungs, which are fully inflated here. When we let the lungs deflate, we can see the heart behind the sternum, contained within its protective jacket of pericardium. To see it better, we'll take the lungs, the sternum, and the pericardium out of the picture. This is the heart. This is the diaphragm. The major blood vessels that lead into and out of the heart take up almost as much space as the heart itself. Now that we've seen where the heart is, we'll take a detailed look at it. We'll look at its 4 chambers and its 4 valves. Then we'll look at the great vessels that enter and leave the heart, and lastly, we'll look at the coronary arteries. Because we so often see simplified diagrams of the heart like this, we tend to think the atria, the inlet chambers, are above, and the ventricles, the pumping chambers, are below. It's perhaps surprising to see that in reality, the atria aren't above the ventricles, they're behind them. Here's the heart in isolation. Here are the ventricles in front. Here are the atria behind. This generous coating of epicardial fat makes it hard to see the 4 chambers distinctly. To see them more clearly, we'll go to a heart in which almost all the fat has been removed. In this specimen, all 4 chambers have been distended with equal pressure, making the atria somewhat larger than normal. This is a directly posterior view of the heart. This is a directly anterior view. The massive thick-walled left ventricle projects forward and to the left. The thinner-walled right ventricle is partially wrapped around the left one. We'll see the ventricles by themselves in a minute. For now, let's go round to the back and look at the 2 atria. This is the left atrium. This is the right atrium. Blood coming from the upper part of the body enters the right atrium by way of the superior vena cava. Blood coming from the lower part of the body enters it by way of the much larger inferior vena cava. In a more intact dissection, here's the inferior vena cava coming up through the diaphragm and almost immediately entering the right atrium. In addition to the 2 venae cavae, blood from the heart itself enters the right atrium under here by way of the coronary sinus, which we'll see later. From the upper part of the right atrium, this blind pouch, the right auricle or atrial appendage, projects forwards. The thin wall of the right atrium is formed largely of muscle. When the atrium contracts in diastole, the blood in it passes forwards into the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve, which is here. The left atrium and the right atrium are in contact here, where they share a common wall, the interatrial septum, which lies quite obliquely. To look at the inside of the right atrium, we'll remove this part of its wall. Here's the opening of the superior vena cava above and of the inferior vena cava below. Here's the opening of the coronary sinus. This is the part of the atrial wall that's shared with the left atrium, the interatrial septum. This thin oval patch in the septum is the fossa ovale, the remnant of the foramen ovale that connected the two atria in intrauterine life. Here we're looking forwards into the tricuspid valve. We'll see more of it when we look at the right ventricle. Now we'll move on to look at the left atrium. Blood coming from the lungs enters the left atrium by way of the 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right lung, 2 from the left. The left atrium, like the right one, has a blind pouch, the left auricle or atrial appendage, which projects upwards and forwards. In diastole, the blood that's in the left atrium passes forwards into the left ventricle through the left atrioventricular valve or mitral valve, which is here. To see inside the left atrium, we'll remove this part of its wall. With the 4 pulmonary veins removed, the inside of the left atrium is relatively featureless. Here's the interatrial septum again, and here's the remnant of the foramen ovale seen from the left side. Here we're looking forwards into the mitral valve. Now we'll move on to look at the 2 ventricles and their inlet valves. To see them clearly, we'll look at a heart in which the right and left atrium have been removed, leaving just the 2 ventricles. Here's the right ventricle seen from the right side. Here's the left ventricle seen from the front. Going round to the back, this is the right ventricle. This is the left one. They're separated by the interventricular septum, which is here. We're looking forwards into the wide-open atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid on the right, the mitral on the left. On the right side, blood passes downwards and forwards to fill the right ventricle in diastole. Then, in systole, it passes upwards and to the left into the pulmonary trunk, passing through the pulmonary valve, which is here. On the left, blood also passes downwards and forwards to fill the ventricle, then gets turned completely around in systole, passing upwards and backwards into the aorta. It passes through the aortic valve, which is out of sight, here. To see inside the right ventricle, we'll remove this part of its wall. The tricuspid valve is here. We'll look at it in a minute. The pulmonary valve is up here. The anterior part of the right ventricle, the apex, extends out of sight, down here, among these intersecting bands of muscle called trabeculae. This is part of the interventricular septum. The left ventricle is on the other side of it. Now let's take a look at the tricuspid valve and its appendages. The tricuspid valve is also called the right atrioventricular valve. It usually has 3 cusps, sometimes only 2. Here there are 3. They're known as the septal, anterior, and posterior cusps. The posterior cusp is partly out of sight. These strands of tendon-like material attached near the edges of the valve cusps are the chordae tendineae. They arise from papillary muscles, which project from the wall of the ventricle. The papillary muscles and chordae tendineae prevent the cusps of the valve from prolapsing back into the atrium during systole. Here's the tricuspid valve set in motion passively by an intermittent current of water. When pressure in the ventricle rises, the cusps of the valve close together along quite an irregular line. The inside of the right ventricle is made irregular not only by the tricuspid valve and its appendages, but also by these numerous bands of muscle, the trabeculae carni. The trabeculae form a dense crisscross pattern over much of the ventricular wall, especially here toward the apex. To see the outflow pathway of the right ventricle, we'll go to a different specimen. The tapering part of the right ventricle that leads up to the pulmonary valve is known as the infundibulum and also as the conus. Unlike the rest of the right ventricle, its lining is smooth. We'll look at the pulmonary valve in a minute. Now we'll move on to take a look inside the left ventricle. We'll remove this part of its wall. The mitral valve is here. The aortic valve is out of sight up here. This is the apex of the ventricle. This part of the ventricular wall forms the interventricular septum. Here's the left ventricle in cross-section. Here's the right ventricle. The interventricular septum is curved. The left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right, and it's circular in cross-section, while the right ventricle is C-shaped. Here, we're looking backward into the mitral valve. To see it better, we'll return to the previous dissection and go round to a view from behind. The mitral valve, also called the left atrioventricular valve, has two cusps. They're called the anterior cusp and the posterior cusp, though in reality they're more upper and lower. Chordae tendineae from both cusps converge on two sets of papillary muscles. These on the posterolateral wall of the ventricle, and these on the anteromedial wall. Here are the same papillary muscles seen from the apex of the ventricle. Each group of papillary muscles sends chordae tendineae to each of the cusps of the mitral valve. Here's the mitral valve in motion, seen from the apex of the left ventricle. Here are the papillary muscles, seen very close. Above the mitral valve, we're looking upward and backward along the outflow tract of the left ventricle toward the aortic valve. In this cutaway dissection, we can see the outflow tract of the left ventricle from the side. Here's the aortic valve. We've left intact part of the anterior cusp of the mitral valve, along with the chordae tendineae and papillary muscles. The anterior cusp of the mitral valve forms part of the wall of the outflow tract, so blood flows past it this way in diastole and this way in systole. Here's the anterior cusp of the mitral valve in motion, with the mitral valve opening below it and the outflow tract above it.